The skies above Vega 4 were perpetually dark, choked by the aftermath of countless battles fought on its surface. The atmosphere carried the lingering taste of ash and metal, a relic of the advanced weaponry that had scarred this desolate planet. Its ground, once rich with minerals and life, was now a barren wasteland silent except for the howling winds that swept across the dead land. Here, ruins of a forgotten era stood as solemn reminders of a time when this planet was the heart of a powerful empire. Stone towers, now crumbling, jutted out from the earth like broken teeth, casting long, ominous shadows over the rocky plains. Among these ruins, deep within a particularly ancient fortress, there was something alive, something terrible. The beast-in ancient war dog bred by the Alvaron Empire lay coiled in the dark recesses of what once might have been a grand hall. Its body was a grotesque patchwork of biology and cybernetics, designed to be a perfect war machine. Its skin, gray and leathery, was stretched taut over a hulking frame, while metal plates fused into its flesh covered parts of its torso and legs. Its head was a fearsome sight, a wide, elongated skull lined with sharp, jagged teeth, and two burning red eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The creature had been abandoned, left to rot when its Alvaron masters were wiped out in a long-forgotten war. For centuries, it had wandered the ruins, surviving off whatever it could hunt in this dead place. It was no longer a soldier of war, it was a starving, desperate monster, a creature of instinct and rage. Legends of this creature had spread throughout the galaxy. The Ruins Beast, they called it, though its true name had long been forgotten. Some claimed it was immortal, that it had killed any who ventured too close to its lair. Few dared to test the tales, and those who did never returned. Yet, Jackson Holt was never one for legends, or for fear. Jackson had arrived on Vega 4 not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. A wild human from the lawless Outer Rim colonies, he was known for taking risks that others would deem insane. His life had always been about survival, taking whatever jobs he could, running from whatever authorities sought to capture him. But now, he was out of options. His last job had gone sideways, leaving him stranded, with no ship and no crew. Vega 4 had been his only chance at hiding from those who pursued him. He knew the planet's reputation empty, desolate, and cursed, perfect for someone looking to disappear. As he picked his way through the ruins, Jackson couldn't help but admire the place. Despite its decay, there was something majestic about the architecture, the way the stone walls had been etched with intricate symbols, some of which still glowed faintly in the darkness. His booted feet crunched over broken tiles as he explored deeper into the fortress. Every instinct told him to be on guard. This place felt alive, not with the warmth of life, but with something darker. He had heard stories about this planet, of the war dog that still roamed the ancient battlefields, a creature from a time when the Alvarons dominated the stars. But Jackson didn't believe in ghost stories. At least, not until he heard the growl. It was low, guttural, and ancient, a sound that made his heart skip a beat. Jackson froze. His hand instinctively moved to the blaster on his hip, but he didn't draw it. He scanned the shadows around him, eyes darting across the room, searching for movement. There it was, barely visible at first, a hulking form moving slowly between the pillars of the ruined hall. Jackson could barely make out its features in the dim light, but the size alone was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through his body. The war dog stepped into a shaft of light, revealing its hideous form. Its red eyes locked onto Jackson, and for a moment, there was no sound except the rasp of its breath. The creature was monstrous. It stood nearly as tall as a small shuttle, its back hunched with powerful muscles. A metal plating, tarnished and worn from years of exposure, covered parts of its body. Scars crisscrossed its flesh, and its mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that could rip through steel. It stared at Jackson with those burning red eyes, and in that moment, Jackson understood why no one ever returned from this place. But Jackson was different. Instead of raising his blaster and firing, Jackson did something no sane person would ever do. He dropped to one knee. Slowly, cautiously, he placed his blaster on the ground and raised both hands in a gesture of submission. He had encountered dangerous creatures before, and if there was one thing he knew, it was that most animals, no matter how fierce, responded to body language. It was a gamble, a wild, reckless gamble. The war dog growled again, louder this time, stepping closer. Its massive paws crunched over the stone as it circled Jackson, its eyes never leaving him. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Any sudden movement, and he'd be dead. The beast stopped in front of him, sniffing the air. Jackson could feel its hot breath on his face, could see the jagged teeth inches away from his throat. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the beast lowered its head slightly, its growl fading to a low rumble. Jackson slowly extended his hand, his palm facing down, and gently touched the creature's head. Its skin was rough, almost like sandpaper, and its body trembled slightly under his touch. But it didn't attack. Instead, it let out a low, almost sorrowful whine. Jackson's mind raced. This was no ordinary war beast. It had been abandoned, left behind by its creators to survive in the ruins for centuries. It was hungry, angry, and afraid. But in that moment, Jackson saw something else in its eyes: loneliness. The same loneliness he had felt ever since he had been forced to leave his home, ever since he had lost his crew, his ship, his friends. In that moment, Jackson made a decision that would change his life forever. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice calm and steady. "I know what it's like to be left behind." The beast stared at him, unblinking, as if trying to understand his words. "Let's get you out of here," Jackson said, rising slowly to his feet. To his astonishment, the war dog didn't attack. It didn't flee. It simply watched as he stood, and when he began to walk toward the exit, the creature followed. The wild human had done the impossible. He had tamed the ancient war dog. But neither of them knew what lay ahead, how this bond would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Chapter 2. The hunted become the hunters. As Jackson and his new companion walked out of the ruins, the eerie quiet of Vega 4 was broken only by the soft crunch of their footsteps. The massive war dog followed closely behind him, its every movement shadowing his steps. Though Jackson's heart was still pounding from the shock of his encounter, there was a growing sense of unease that settled over him. The galaxy was never a safe place for a human like him, let alone one who was now traveling with a terrifying beast of legend. Jackson paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. In the distance, the barren landscape stretched for miles, but something caught his eye: movement. Several ships were descending from the sky, their sleek designs unmistakable. He squinted, recognizing the markings on their hulls. It was the mercenaries, the bounty hunters. They had found him. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He knew they would come for him eventually, but he hadn't expected them to track him to a backwater like Vega for so quickly. The war dog, sensing the tension, let out a low growl. Its eyes narrowed as it sniffed the air, clearly aware of the approaching danger. Jackson glanced down at the creature and nodded. "Yeah, I feel it too," he said. He had two options: run and hope to lose them in the wilderness, or face them head-on. Jackson wasn't the type to run, but the sheer number of ships descending made him second-guess his usual bravado. He had no backup, no weapons powerful enough to take on a fleet, and his only ally was the ancient beast walking beside him. His mind raced through possible strategies. The mercenaries would land and fan out, scanning the ruins for any sign of him. If they found him, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him and take the bounty on his head. Worse, they might capture the war dog and sell it to the highest bidder. A living relic of a powerful war race would fetch an unimaginable price on the black market. Jackson glanced down at his makeshift companion, the war dog's eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the alien sun. It was a terrifying creature, yes, but in the short time they had been together, Jackson felt a strange connection with it. The war dog had chosen not to kill him, had followed him willingly. Maybe, just maybe, it could do more than that. He crouched down, placing a hand on the beast's thick neck. "We're outnumbered, buddy, but if we're smart, we might just have a chance." The war dog tilted its head slightly, as if listening. "I need you to trust me," Jackson said, looking into the creature's crimson eyes. "If we're going to get out of this, we'll have to work together." The war dog gave a deep, rumbling growl, but there was no aggression in its tone, only understanding. Jackson quickly surveyed the terrain. The mercenaries were closing in fast, their ships now hovering just above the ground as soldiers disembarked. They were equipped with heavy blasters, armor, and tracking drones that would sweep the area for any signs of life. The war dog might be able to take on a few of them, but against an entire squadron, they'd be overwhelmed. An idea sparked in Jackson's mind: crazy, but it just might work. He turned back to the war dog and pointed toward a narrow canyon not far from their current position. We need to get them into that choke point. If we can force them into a tight space, their numbers won't matter. Without another word, Jackson sprinted toward the canyon, the war dog following closely behind. The mercenaries, now aware of movement, sent drones buzzing toward their location, but Jackson knew the terrain well. He and the war dog weaved through the rocky outcrops, avoiding the drone's sensors. Once inside the canyon, Jackson quickly scouted the narrowest part of place where the walls closed in, creating a bottleneck. It was the perfect place for an ambush. He turned to the war dog, who was already sniffing the air, its body tensed and ready. "You wait here," Jackson whispered, crouching behind a rock. "When they come through, we hit them hard. Just don't eat me, okay?" The war dog growled softly, but Jackson took it as a sign of agreement. The mercenaries, unaware of the trap, began to funnel into the canyon, their blasters raised and their eyes scanning for any sign of their target. Jackson waited, his breath steady, as the first soldier passed through the narrow choke point. Then another, and another. When half the squad was inside the canyon, Jackson gave a sharp whistle. Instantly, the war dog exploded into action. With a deafening roar, the massive beast launched itself at the soldiers, its jaws clamping down on the nearest mercenary with bone-crushing force. The sound of blaster fire filled the air, but the war dog moved with incredible speed and power, ripping through the soldiers like paper. Jackson didn't waste a second. He darted from his hiding spot, using the confusion to take out a few more mercenaries with precise shots from his blaster. The canyon turned into chaos. The mercenaries, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the war dog's attack, scrambled to regroup, but it was too late. One by one, they fell to the beast's savage strikes, their armor offering little protection against its razor-sharp claws and crushing jaws. Jackson fought alongside the war dog, taking down any soldier that strayed too far from the pack. The two of them worked in unison, a deadly combination of human strategy and alien brute strength. Within minutes, the canyon fell silent once more. The mercenaries lay scattered on the ground, their bodies broken and their ships abandoned. Jackson leaned against a rock, panting heavily as he surveyed the carnage. The war dog stood nearby, its chest heaving, but there was no sign of injury on its massive frame. It had survived centuries in the ruins, and now it had taken down an entire squad of heavily armed mercenaries. Jackson couldn't help but laugh, a mix of relief and disbelief. "I don't know what they were feeding you, but you're one hell of a fighter." The war dog's red eyes flickered as it looked at Jackson, and for a brief moment, Jackson thought he saw a glimmer of respect in its gaze. But this victory was only temporary. Jackson knew more would come. The bounty on his head would only grow, and now that word would spread of the war dog's existence. Others would come hunting for it, too. Jackson pushed off the rock and walked over to the beast, placing a hand on its head. "We're in this together now, you and me. Whatever comes next, we face it as a team." The war dog let out a low, approving growl. Together, they would face the Galaxy Man and Beast, hunted and feared. But Jackson had a feeling they weren't the ones who should be afraid. Chapter 3. The Galaxy Takes Notice. The news of Jackson and the war dog's victory spread like wildfire throughout the galaxy. Mercenaries, bounty hunters, and opportunists alike whispered of the wild human who had tamed the untamable, a war dog from the long-lost Alvaron Empire. Some said Jackson was a fool. Others believed he was dangerous, someone to be reckoned with. But the real problem was, those in power started to pay attention. It didn't take long for the story to reach the ears of the Syndicate Lords, a powerful faction of criminal overlords who operated in the shadows of the galaxy. They had long coveted the technology and weapons of the ancient empires, and the war dog was one of the most sought-after relics of those eras. Rumors of the beast's power and loyalty were legendary, and owning it would give anyone an unstoppable advantage. The Syndicate wasted no time. They placed an even larger bounty on Jackson's head, not only for him but for the war dog as well. To them, the creature was more than just a weapon, it was a symbol of dominance. Meanwhile, Jackson and the war dog continued their journey across the galaxy, moving from one remote system to another, always staying a step ahead of the hunters. Despite the chaos that seemed to follow them, Jackson began to feel a sense of companionship with the war dog. They fought together, survived together, and slowly, the line between man and beast blurred. The war dog, once a mindless killing machine, had started to show signs of intelligence loyalty even. Jackson had named it Grim, after an old Earth legend of a guardian beast. One evening, while they camped on the forest moon of Karnak, 7, Jackson sat by the fire, watching as Grim lay near him, its large head resting on its paws. The quiet moment was a rare reprieve from the constant threat of being hunted. "I don't know what your life was like before," Jackson mused aloud, staring into the flames, "but I reckon it wasn't much better than mine." Grim let out a soft growl, its red eyes reflecting the firelight. Jackson chuckled, tossing a scrap of food toward the creature, which it snapped up effortlessly. "Yeah, you're right. Doesn't really matter now, does it? We've got each other, and that's all we need." As if in response, Grim stretched and let out a contented huff. Jackson leaned back against a tree, his eyes scanning the darkened sky. But he wasn't foolish enough to think they were safe. He had made a name for himself now, and the galaxy's predators were circling. His instincts proved correct when the forest around them suddenly lit up with flashing lights. A wave of small drones descended from the treetops, their sensors locking onto Jackson and Grim. Immediately, Jackson grabbed his blaster, but it was too late. The drones had already called in reinforcements. A ship roared overhead, its engines deafening as it hovered above their camp. The syndicate had found them. Jackson swore under his breath and glanced at Grim. "Looks like our peaceful evening just got ruined, buddy." The ship landed with a heavy thud, and the ramp lowered to reveal a dozen armored figures, syndicate enforcers. They marched forward with military precision, their weapons trained on Jackson and Grim. From the shadows of the ship emerged a tall figure clad in ornate armor, the syndicate's insignia emblazoned on their chest. It was Ravik, one of the most feared syndicate captains in the galaxy, known for his ruthless efficiency and unmatched combat skills. Jackson rose to his feet, keeping his blaster at the ready, though he knew he was outgunned. Ravik approached with a predatory smile, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You've caused quite a stir, Holt," Ravik said, his voice dripping with condescension. "A human taming an Alvaron war dog? The syndicate has been looking for something like this for a long time." Jackson clenched his jaw, his mind racing for a plan. "I'm guessing you're not here to offer a friendly handshake." Ravik chuckled darkly. "No, I'm here to take what's mine." He gestured to Grim. "That beast belongs to the syndicate now. Hand it over, and I might let you walk away alive." Grim growled low, sensing the threat. Its muscles tensed, and its eyes burned brighter, ready to attack at any moment. Jackson glanced at his companion, and then back at Ravik. "You want him?" Jackson said, his voice cold. "Come and take him." Without another word, Ravik raised his hand, signaling his enforcers to attack. But Jackson and Grim were ready. With a snarl, Grim lunged at the nearest enforcer, its massive jaws clamping down on their arm and tossing them aside like a rag doll. Jackson fired his blaster, taking down 2 more before diving for cover behind a tree. The forest erupted in chaos, blaster fire and roars filling the air. Jackson ducked as a blaster shot narrowly missed his head, and he returned fire, taking out one of the syndicate soldiers. Meanwhile, Grim tore through their ranks with terrifying efficiency, its brute strength overwhelming the armored enforcers. Ravik watched the carnage with a sneer, unimpressed by his soldiers' failure to contain the beast. He stepped forward, pulling a long, wicked-looking blade from his belt. The blade hummed with energy, glowing faintly in the darkness. Jackson saw Ravik approaching and cursed under his breath. The syndicate captain was far more dangerous than the rest of his men. He couldn't take him head-on, not with that blade. He needed an edge. Grim, having dealt with the remaining enforcers, turned its attention to Ravik, growling menacingly. Ravik, however, didn't flinch. He moved with an unnatural grace, his blade flashing as he slashed at the war dog. Grim dodged the first strike, but Ravik was fast, too fast. He spun around and struck again, his blade grazing Grim's side. Jackson fired at Ravik, but the captain deflected the shot with his blade, the energy field around it absorbing the blast. Ravik smiled, his eyes locked on Jackson. "Is that all you've got, Holt?" Ravik taunted. "I expected more from someone with your reputation." Jackson gritted his teeth. He had one chance, and it was a long shot. He needed to get Ravik away from Grim and expose a weakness. "Grim!" Jackson shouted, calling the war dog back. The beast hesitated for a moment, reluctant to leave its prey, but it obeyed, retreating to Jackson's side. Ravik smirked, thinking Jackson had backed down. But Jackson had something else in mind. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small device, a sonic detonator. It wasn't a powerful explosive, but it would emit a shockwave strong enough to disrupt Ravik's balance and give Jackson the opening he needed. "Hey, Ravik!" Jackson shouted. The captain turned just in time to see Jackson toss the detonator toward him. The device exploded in a blinding flash of light and sound, sending Ravik stumbling backward, disoriented. Jackson didn't waste a second. He charged forward, his blaster raised, and fired 3 quick shots. The first 2 missed, but the third hit Ravik square in the chest. The captain staggered, his armor sizzling from the impact, but he didn't go down. Instead, he glared at Jackson, his eyes burning with fury. "You'll regret that," Ravik growled, raising his blade for one final strike. But before he could move, Grim lunged from the shadows, its jaws locking around Ravik's arm and yanking him to the ground. The captain screamed as the war dog's teeth tore through his armor, pinning him beneath its massive weight. Jackson stood over the defeated captain, his blaster trained on Ravik's head. "I told you," Jackson said coldly. "You're not taking him." With a final pull, Grim ripped the blade from Ravik's hand and let out a deafening roar. The captain's eyes were wide with fear as he lay helpless beneath the beast. Jackson didn't kill Ravik. Instead, he turned and walked away, motioning for Grim to follow. The syndicate might have been powerful, but Jackson knew that taking Ravik's life would only put a larger target on his back. Besides, he had made his point. As they disappeared into the forest, Jackson glanced down at Grim, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like we just made some new enemies, pal." Grim let out a low growl, but there was something almost content in the sound. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Word of Jackson's victory over Ravik and the syndicate spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, whispers of the wild human and his monstrous companion reached even the farthest colonies. It wasn't just the story of a human taming a war dog that had people talking. It was the fact that Jackson had outsmarted one of the most feared syndicate captains and lived to tell the tale. Some called him a hero, others called him a fool. Either way, Jackson had become a legend. But fame came with a price. The syndicate wasn't the only faction taking notice now. Galactic governments, pirate kings, and even researchers from the most prestigious institutions had an interest in Jackson's war dog. They wanted it for its power, its genetic secrets, and, most of all, the chance to harness a weapon of such ancient strength. For Jackson, that meant only one thing: he and Grim were more hunted than ever. Jackson and Grim had left the moon of Karnak, 7, drifting through the edges of the galaxy, always on the move. They hopped from one backwater planet to another, staying one step ahead of bounty hunters and syndicate agents. But even as they ran, Jackson knew this couldn't last forever. Eventually, they would have to make a stand. He just didn't know when or where. One day, as they flew through the vast emptiness of space in a stolen freighter, Jackson received a message. The screen on the ship's console flickered to life, revealing a face he hadn't seen in years: Riatanis, a former crewmate and one of the best smugglers in the galaxy. Her fiery red hair was still as unruly as ever, but the serious expression on her face was new. "Jackson," she said, without any preamble, "we need to talk." Jackson leaned back in the pilot's seat, scratching the stubble on his chin. "I figured this day would come. What's the catch?" Ria's eyes darted towards something off-screen, then back to him. "The syndicate is mobilizing. They've put a new bounty on your head high enough to make even the most loyal friends turn on you." "Nice to see you haven't changed," Jackson quipped, but his smile faded. "How bad is it?" "It's bad, Jax. We're talking multiple factions, all gunning for you, and that beast of yours. And the syndicate isn't going to stop until they have both of you, dead or alive." Jackson glanced at Grim, who was lying at the far end of the cockpit, its massive frame almost too large for the cramped space. The war dog's red eyes met his, and Jackson could feel the weight of the decision looming over him. They had run long enough. "Where are they coming from?" Jackson asked, leaning forward. Ria sighed. "Everywhere. But there's a place in Old Station on the edge of the Tyrian Nebula. I know some people there who might help. It's off the radar, and the syndicate won't find you easily. It's your best shot at staying hidden long enough to figure out your next move." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "Why are you helping me, Ria? Last I checked, you weren't in the charity business." Ria's expression softened. and for the first time in a long while, Jackson saw the familiar glint of the woman who had once been part of his crew, who had saved his life more times than he could count. "Because I owe you, and because I know what it's like to be hunted." Jackson considered her offer for a moment before nodding. "All right, send me the coordinates." "Already done," she said. "But Jax, be careful. The syndicate has sent something new after you. Something they've been keeping in the dark for a long time. Even Grimm might not be enough to stop it." Before he could ask what she meant, the transmission cut off, leaving Jackson staring at the empty screen. He glanced down at the coordinates that had been transmitted to the ship's NAV System A remote station, hidden deep in the nebula. It was a long shot, but it was the best option they had. Jackson set the course and turned to Grimm. "Looks like we're heading into the nebula, buddy. I hope you're ready for whatever's coming." Grimm growled softly, its red eyes flickering with a strange, knowing intensity. The journey through the Tyrian Nebula was treacherous. The dense clouds of ionized gas played havoc with the ship's sensors, making navigation almost impossible. Jackson had to rely on old-fashioned piloting, trusting his instincts to guide them through the swirling mists of light and shadow. The freighter groaned under the strain, and more than once, Jackson thought they might not make it. But after hours of careful maneuvering, they finally reached the station. It was an old, derelict outpost, once used by smugglers and traders long before the syndicate had seized control of the surrounding systems. The station's hull was rusted and pockmarked with age, but it still held together, a lone fortress in the middle of the nebula. Jackson docked the ship and stepped out into the dimly lit hangar, Grimm following closely behind him. The station was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. "Stay close," Jackson muttered to Grimm as they made their way through the winding corridors. They finally reached a large, circular chamber where Rhea was waiting. But she wasn't alone. Standing next to her was a figure Jackson hadn't expected to see, a tall, armored man with cold blue eyes and a scar running down the side of his face. "Ravik," Jackson growled, his hand instinctively reaching for his blaster. The syndicate captain smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Relax, Holt. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it this far." Rhea stepped forward, raising her hands to defuse the situation. "Easy, Jackson. Ravik's here because things have changed. The syndicate isn't just after you anymore. They're after something bigger, Grimm." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ravik's expression darkened. "The syndicate discovered something ancient, something connected to the Alvaron Empire. They believe Grimm isn't just a war dog, it's a key to unlocking a power that could reshape the galaxy." Jackson glanced at Grimm, the weight of Ravik's words sinking in. The war dog stared back at him, as if sensing the truth behind the captain's words. Rhea nodded. "That's why I brought you here. We need to figure out what Grimm really is before the syndicate gets their hands on him. Because if they do, it won't just be you they're hunting, it'll be the entire galaxy." Jackson took a deep breath, the enormity of the situation hitting him all at once. He had thought he was just a man on the run, but now, it seemed like he was part of something much larger, something ancient, something dangerous. "All right," Jackson said, his voice steady. "What's the plan?" Ravik stepped forward, his cold eyes meeting Jackson's. "We're going to war." Epilogue: The War Dog's Legacy. As the stars outside the station swirled in the nebula, Jackson and Grimm stood side by side, preparing for the fight of their lives. The galaxy was watching, and soon, everyone would know the truth about the wild human and the ancient war dog. But whatever came next, Jackson knew one thing for certain. He and Grimm would face it together. Because this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about changing the galaxy forever.